Thank you all for joining us for our third installment in 2014 of the Great Decisions discussion series here at the Boston Public Library. We're here tonight to discuss a topic that is always timely, and especially so this month, Israel-U.S. relations. We will be starting tonight's discussion with Professor Ilan Troen. Ilan Troen is the Stoll Family Professor in Israel Studies at Brandeis University and Director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies. He has served as Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences at Ben-Gurion University in Israel and as Director of the Ben-Gurion Research Institute and Archives in Sde Boker. He has authored or edited numerous books in American, Jewish, and Israeli history. He is also the founding editor of Israel Studies, the leading journal in this field, and co-edits the Schusterman series in Israel Studies. His publications include Jewish Centers and Peripheries, European Jewry between America and Israel 50 years after World War II, Divergent Jewish Cultures, Israel and America, Jews and Muslims in the Arab World, Haunted by Past, Real and Imagined, and most recently, Tel Aviv, the First Century, Visions, Designs, Actualities. He has lectured widely across the US and Europe, as well as in South Africa, Australia, China, and Turkey. Dr. Troen and his family make their permanent home in Omer, a community outside Beersheba. Please join me in welcoming Professor Troen.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. There's another part to it. I was actually born in Boston, and as a kid, I used to come to the Boston Public Library, where I was told to be quiet and to read and never to speak. So this is the first time that takes place. A few words about the topic, and I was asked to talk about the affinity versus the real interest between America and Israel. And I can tell you is that, unlike perhaps my partner in this symposium, I only took one course in American foreign policy, and I was trying to recall in preparing for this the title of the book that I had read. It's called Robert Osgood, Ideals and Self-Interest in American Foreign Relations. The book was published in 1953, which immediately tells you about how au courant I happen to be. And I checked it out on Amazon, and the one textbook that I know you can buy in hardcover for 39 cents. And the paperback is interestingly more expensive. It's $4.20. So it's with that kind of a foreign policy wonk background that I address you. My interests really come from another place. They come from cultural history and from social history. And I'm probably better at misinterpreting the past as opposed to misinterpreting the future. And that may become evident by the time I finish. My bottom line is that interests prevail, but affinities may help a great deal in perceiving joint interest and in nurturing good relations. I've written about both countries. I once headed the Association for American Studies in Israel, but also, as I indicated, spent part of my youth at Boston, where I studied at the Latin School. And on the frieze in the Great Hall, you find names like Cotton and Increase Mather, John Hancock, Benjamin Franklin. And so I have a sense for what this country is about and its culture. But my home has become Israel, and I have a deep sense of what that culture is, and I consider myself a binational. Now, that just may be an accident of no significance, but I would claim it enables me to inform you, I hope, on the issue at hand. Let me begin with Israel. It's and there are a couple of points to be made. First, it is the Arab countries and Arabs in the contemporary world who make the best case for the affinity between Israel and America. It is they who burn the American and Israel flag together. It is they who see America and Israel as partners. It is they who define one as the big Satan and the other one as the little Satan. In fact, I suppose I could just rest my case right here and say, see, that's how more people in the world see us than perhaps even American Jews view themselves in their relationship to Israel. In short, people in the Middle East very often view both America and Israel as the outsiders, as non-indigenous, and a threatening peer who endanger the interests of the genuine residents of that part of the world. Now, the pairing of Israel and America is an oft-repeated trope by Israelis and Americans themselves. Whether or not this is actually true is a subject for academic debate. I myself have been curious about the extent to which there are similarities and dissimilarities of the two societies. As I will reflect later, there are both similarities and dissimilarities. What is evident, though, is that both the search for evidence of such a connection and the widespread sense that it actually exists informs public impressions. Final point in this introduction is that Israel may be the only country in the Middle East where an American flag has never been burned. Until recently, it was a society in which the study of the West, including the United States, was part of the curriculum of the universities, something which can't be said about other parts of the Middle East. Translations of American fiction is a huge industry. American teaching and American models in the social sciences and applied sciences are scrutinized for applicability. In short, Israel, or many Israelis, if they look around the world and see to where they have an affinity, where they naturally belong or would like to belong, view the United States as a model. Let me give you a few quick examples of this. The second language of Israel is really English, even in many cases if one is an Arab speaker. And that's not just because the British were there between the world wars and during the period of the Mandate. In television, in movies, in the arts, it is America that predominates. Where do Israeli academics like myself go on sabbatical? We tend to go to the United States, and that was a process that began after the Second World War. Indeed, in 1943, a statistic that I happen to know, of 143 professors at the Hebrew University, none were trained in America. Most of them were trained in Central Europe. Somebody was trained in Italy. Another one was trained in France. In short, it was a Central European university. Heidelberg in the Middle East. Today, one really needs an American degree in order to get ahead, and that is the society towards which Israelis orient. One of the largest, if not the largest, expatriate Israeli community is in the United States. The other large Jewish community in the world is also in the United States. A century ago, 83% of the world's Jews lived in Europe. Today, 83% of the world's Jews are really split between North America and Israel. The place names. There's a strong resistance to taking names that do not resonate with the Bible or with Jewish history. Were the few exceptions. You can go to Kennedy Park in Jerusalem. You can go to a college which is on Givat, Washington, or in Hebrew, Washington. My favorite example of distorting is Lincoln. The people who translated Lincoln didn't excise the second L. They didn't know it did not have to be pronounced. In politics, if you want to have a protest movement against the establishment, call yourselves the Black Panthers, whether you happen to be black or not. It's again a kind of influence or intrusion of American politics as a model for Israeli dissenters or establishment people. Academic models. When Coleman came to Israel in the 1960s, he established a new paradigm for how schools ought to be organized, and he introduced the notion of equality and inequality. If you wanted to read a textbook in economics when I was a student, you read Samuelson in Hebrew. If you're an Israeli Nobel laureate, and we've had a bunch in the last decade, you teach in Israel and at Princeton and at Caltech, and in short, you become a binational and you live in both worlds. The stock exchange has more companies, aside from Canada, the NASDAQ, than any other country in the world. Israel, on its own side, employs about 100,000 Americans in a whole variety of industries, not just high-tech and computers, but also in the making of hummus. Strauss's factories in North Carolina and Virginia are the major producers in America of that wonderful Middle Eastern food, which was never eaten in Poland. Pharmaceuticals, the same kind of phenomenon. In short, there is a great deal of synergy and interchange. Now, my son, who's writing a doctoral dissertation at the Hebrew University on a subject that's germane to this, and it has to do with how Israel views itself in terms of normality. Now, normality is a huge issue in contemporary Jewish history. Jews were considered the exception, and that was often a cause for anti-Semitism, and indeed one of the reasons why Zionism was imagined and developed as an ideology. What does it mean to be a normal state? Where do you look to as a reference point? And what he's discovered by going through the proceedings of the Israeli Knesset, its parliament, its Congress, you can do that with some wonderful search engines and do it very efficiently, that Israelis at the beginning part of the state thought that the best society in the world was Great Britain and Western Europe. Over the course of time, and you can actually measure this, by the 1970s, the ideal society becomes the United States. And it comes up in debates. Where do they have the best laws for automobile safety? Israeli parliamentarians think it's the United States. How do you have the best tax laws? What are the best social policies? Do you look to Scandinavia? Where do you look to? What is normality? There's a wonderful story, and I hope I won't be abusing my time, that is germane here. A man by the name of Louis Gutmann, from whom social scientists learned the notion of the Gutmann scale, came to Israel in 1948 during the War of Independence, and he was immediately brought to Ben Gurion because he had served in the American Army and the Pentagon during the Second World War, and Israel didn't have military experts. But what did he do in America? He served as the editor of the 4th volume of the American Soldier series, the most important series in social surveys till that time. And he said, well, if you do surveys for the American Army, do them for us. And what he was concerned about was what the Americans were concerned about. How do you make a large army out of people who had never fought before, who come from many different kinds of places? What will the morale be if you not come from a household like General MacArthur, a military family? And the answer was that Israeli soldiers, those people who came from Cyprus, or who came from the camps of Europe, or who came from the mellahs of the Middle East, when they were told to go into battle, had butterflies in their stomach. And if you read the report, it goes on to say, in fact, that's normal. For when Americans landed in Iwo Jima, they were at first concerned, worried, apprehensive, but they followed orders and they behaved. We too are normal like Americans. America is the normality, the normal standard. If you do psychology, if you do sociology, if you do politics, economics, you name it. America is the standard for judgment of what Israelis imagine is desirable and good. But America can mean different things for Israelis, and Israelis argue with themselves in terms of America. I'll give you one quick example. You all know the Turner thesis. What happens to Europeans when they cross the ocean and they enter the North American forest and come into the frontier? One school of Israelis, they called Canaanites, believe that, well, we can become like the Americans, because you see, the Americans disconnected themselves from Europe. They became a whole new nation. The response to them was another school of Israelis says, no, 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 we're really like Americans, because you see, when Europeans crossed the Atlantic and came to America, those European germs were transformed by the interaction with the frontier. Israel and Zionism and the Jewish experience in the homeland is one of transformation, not of a strict structure. I could give you many more examples. In short, whether or not there's a direct transfer, There is the understanding that in one way or another, the set standard for interpreting one's experience is through the prism of what people imagined took place here, whether it did or it didn't. One other quick example, and that's important, and it may become important in the discussion, is that there are huge differences between the American and the Hebrew language. And I can tell you that when the American Declaration of Independence was finally translated in the 1960s, Israelis did not know America till after the Second World War. There were two books in Hebrew published in 1898 in Warsaw. The first was Uncle Tom's Cabin, and the second was Bellamy's Looking Backward. By the 1920s, they did Jack London. In the 1930s, you could find a translation of Charles and Mary Beard. What binds all of them, it is a leftist, socialist, critical view of society and development, and that's what they chose. By the 1960s, you could read Mickey Spillane, you could read science fiction, you could read Valley of the Dolls. America becomes the place where one learns about the world, but you translate American English into Hebrew and you don't get the same result. One classic case that's germane for the affinities between America and Israel. How do you translate the word people in the American Declaration of Independence into Hebrew? The Hebrew word for people is am, or ummah. The word for people in America, if you look it up in the Webster's Dictionary of the American language rather than the Oxford Dictionary of the English language, and what you get is that people is really an agglomeration of individuals. But if you look for the word people, in Hebrew, you get a folk, a collective, something coherent that is people are bound together. In short, the notion of what a people is in Israel, it is a nation. It is an ethne. It is a group that has transited history together in the past and has come to the present, rather than a place, a society built for the pursuit of individual happiness. It is not individualism, which is the prime value in Israeli society, but collectivism, as opposed to American society with the notion of bowling alone, Putnam, and that whole discourse. So then, what one has is many apparent, and we could look at how people dress, the kind of buildings they put up, what they eat, what they read, but at its core, there are some very substantial differences. I would like to think of it in terms, and I can telegraph this to you, in terms of a social and political economy. When Jews came to Palestine and developed the state of Israel, they did so as a group. A pioneer meant somebody who came in advance of the group and was responsible for it. There was never a Natty Bumppo, never a Virginian. There were never isolated pioneers going off on their own to homestead to build their little house on the prairie on their 80 or 320 acres. That when they came and built a society in which they were a majority. The political and social ecology of a people who become a majority and sovereign in their own land produces a different kind of politics and a different way of looking at the world than American Jews, for example, who came to this country as a minority and remain a minority, and who tend to adopt a different vision of politics. And the politics in this country of many American Jews tends to be defined as liberal or progressive. The politics of Jews who live in their own state as a majority has far more conservative elements than those who come here. So there's a divergence between these two countries for all their similarities. One last point in terms of the discussion that's germane tonight. Israel is a democracy, so is America, but they're different kinds of democracies. This emphasis on the collective as opposed to the individual is at the core. If you take a look, though, at what is called procedural democracy, they're much the same. There are parties, one can vote, freedom of speech, the Bill of Rights in one form or another exist in both societies, whether they're in a constitution or not in a constitution, but there are differences. And the difference is that Israel privileges a prime group. And that group, it is a Jewish and democratic state and is continually befuddled and challenged by how one can negotiate having a state which at once has a national identity rather than being a state of all of its citizens. And that is a perception, that is the challenge, the tension, the angst that disturbs and aggravates Israeli politics at this time, but for many decades previous. And that is something when Americans look at Israel, American Jews and non-American Jews, Gentiles and Jews look at Israel, they're troubled by what it is that they see. But I would only argue to you is that Israel is not unlike most other nations in the world. Most of the countries in Europe still have a cross, whether it's on their flag, whether it's Scandinavia, Great Britain, or the Netherlands. And the notion of a state for all its citizens is a unique American invention. I haven't talked about America, and I'll do so very briefly. America looks at Israel for most of its history since the very beginning in a very romantic and abstract way. The Puritans, a city on a hill, the names they gave to themselves in my same high school frieze, it said Cotton Mather and Increase Mather. It took me a couple of decades before I figured out what that meant. Increase is the English translation of the Hebrew Yosef. Cotton is really junior. It means the small one. So if you're ever worried who is older, Increase or Cotton Mather, if you know the Hebrew, it's not a problem at all. Hebrew was taught at Harvard beginning in the 1730s. The Chautauqua Society in upstate New York built a replica of Jerusalem. One can go on and on. John Steinbeck's great-grandfather was a millenarian who established what could be called a kibbutz in what is today's Tel Aviv in the 1860s. Mark Twain and a host of other Americans went to Israel with a biblical sense of what that country is. It's not just evangelicals. It's a whole host of people within a society that was fundamentally a Christian society, most of whom were Protestants, who imagined Israel in terms of its Bible. The sense of reality of what is really there and what the affinity between American people and Israel comes much later, and it's very much related to politics. America really discovers Israel after the Second World War. And it discovers Israel in terms of a change in American policy, which brought American policy beyond the sending to the shores of Tripoli in northern Africa, the Marines, some 200 years ago, but in terms of a place where it have an enduring and ever-growing presence. That is a product of the new place of America in the world politics after the Second World War, and it was very hesitant. The relationship between America and Israel at independence was tenuous in a very real sense. America didn't send arms, didn't allow for loans, it didn't allow for the substantive materials that were so associated with the relationship between America and Israel today. It recognized Israel, and when the war broke out, it allowed Israel to do what it could do. Indeed, Secretary of State Marshall thought that America, Truman, ought to renounce the recognition of independence of Israel because the Jews were going to lose, and they didn't want to be embarrassed with another disaster of Jews in the 1940s. In short, there's very little political engagement in a way that suggests the kind of alliance that exists today. When does that begin to happen? It happens only after 1956, more particularly 1958, when the Americans, Eisenhower sends Marines to Beirut, and America realizes that it cannot engage in a part of the world where it has major vital interests, oil, geography, influence, important peoples, just by through altruism and through statements. America views the Middle East in the 1950s through the prism of the Cold War. And during that period, it begins to view Israel slowly, hesitantly, as an advantage to its side in the waging of the Cold War. It will fundamentally be not even Kennedy who sends some Hawk missiles, but it'll be President Johnson. It's the 1967 war that causes the revolution. It causes a revolution because Israel emerges as an important regional power, with all the kinds of benefits that an important regional power can bring to the United States that feels it's in mortal combat with an enemy abroad. Israel, until then, is not in any formal alliance. It's excluded from the alliance that brings in Iraq and and Turkey. It's not part of the policy of containment, but its influence grows. In 1973, Nixon sends an air train of munitions. By Reagan's period, and one can go on and measure presidency after presidency, and for all the ruptures and the criticism and the complaints, by and large, that is an alliance that tends to grow. Having said that, and I realize that I'm going beyond my time, one should not mistake the strength of this alliance for one of comedy and one of ease and one of necessary agreement. One could just as easily categorize or catalog the incidents where the United States and Israel disagreed with one another very seriously. Israel opposed the sale of AWACS to Saudi Arabia. It opposes arms sales in general to Saudi Arabia or other Arab countries. In a whole variety of ways, Israel has objected to American policy, and you can see it today in the issue over Iran. Israel is pushing for countering the joint enemy, allegedly, of both through far more vigorous action than one can find in sanctions. I suppose what I'm trying to say, and my sense is that I should cut these introductory remarks short, is that affinity, a sense of sympathy with one another, real or imagined identification of cultural identity is one level of the relationship. It is important because it can abet, it can smoothen, it can catalyze the relationship where real interests are at stake. And the real interests of the United States and Israel actually do exist. They exist because of military considerations, economic considerations, technological considerations, and ultimately, perhaps, because increasingly the nature of the Arab Middle East is to be a region in disarray. The instability of the Middle East, in fact, maybe the items which call for the strengthening of the relationship despite what's happening in the peace process today, no matter what Secretary of State John Kerry has to say, is what's happening in Syria. The troubles that Americans feel with regard to Turkey, the disappointment with the Arab Spring in Egypt, all of these troubling events together with the largest event of all, and that is a real war, a real conflict turning into a kind of holy war, at least on the other side. The rise of fundamentalism, which tends to paint both Israel and America as the enemy. And to quote the ancient Indian adage, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Whatever the relationship between Israel and the United States may be in the cultural sphere, and I think it's real and important, would nevertheless bring them together in the practical sphere of realpolitik. Hopefully in a much more generous way than America and the Saudi Arabians, America and the Iraqis or Iranians at very different times in history. For that cultural bond, the ease of language, the ease of common intellectual and historical traditions make that easier. But ultimately, there is something that both Americans and Israelis have at stake, which is far beyond the power of AIPAC or any other kind of lobby to create, to foster, to nurture.
Thank you, Professor Tran. Our next speaker, Christopher Henzel, is Director of the Office of Israel and Palestinian Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. He is a member of the Senior Foreign Service. From 2011 to 2013, he headed the Office of Regional and Multilateral Affairs in the department's Near East Bureau, responsible for economic and security assistance budgets and for the Sinai Observer Force. From 2010 to 2011, Henzel led the Provincial Reconstruction Team in Mosul, Iraq, and from 2007 to 2010, he was Deputy Chief of Mission and Chargé at the American Embassy in Manama, Bahrain. From 2004 to 2007, he was Counselor for Political Affairs in Amman, Jordan. He has also been posted in Yemen, Pakistan, Mexico, and Saudi Arabia. Henzel is a graduate of the National War College and of the College of the Holy Cross and studied Arabic at the Foreign Service Institute Field School in Tunisia. He has received several State Department Superior Honor Awards, as well as the U.S. Army's Superior Civilian Service Award. Please join me in welcoming Christopher Henzel.
Thank you very much. I want to thank World Boston for giving me the chance to come and speak to you all tonight. It's, how's that? A little better? It's a real pleasure to be able to talk to people who are interested in what we do at the State Department, and I look forward to answering your questions so we can focus on the things you're interested in. But before we get to that, I thought I'd just give a quick overview of the U.S.-Israel relationship. The peace process and the negotiations and the drama surrounding that have been much in the news because they are very important and very interesting, but they tend to overshadow some of the less glamorous stuff that goes on between the two governments. By going over a bit of that tonight, I'd like to, I hope, demonstrate that the U.S.-Israel relationship is a very broad and strong one, and whatever's going on in the peace process, you know, any month or year, there's a very solid relationship between the two governments that complements the solid relationship between the two societies that Dr. Troen was talking about. First of all, my office, we deal with at the working level with the bilateral relationship both with Israel and with the Palestinians, working closely with our colleagues at the American Embassy in Tel Aviv and at the American Consulate General in Jerusalem. The U.S. relationship with Israel, as President Obama has said, is stronger than it ever has been. There are close, frequent consultations between the U.S. leadership and the Israeli leadership, more frequent contact than most any other government you'd find in the world. I mean, maybe with the British or somebody like that. But there's no other relationship I'm aware of where you see the American president and the American Secretary of State talking to their counterparts as often as happens in the U.S.-Israel relationship. There's, of course, very frequent engagement by the American Congress with Israel and deep interest. And then, of course, the day-to-day contacts and cooperation that takes place between our embassy and the government in Tel Aviv and in Washington, between my office and the State Department and the Israeli embassy. In addition to these day-to-day contacts, the two governments step back periodically and take a broader strategic look at our relationship and the joint challenges and opportunities we face. For example, there's the U.S.-Israel Strategic Dialogue. It's chaired on the Israeli side by Minister Yuval Steinitz. He's the Minister for Strategic Affairs and Intelligence. And on the American side by the Deputy Secretary of State, Bill Burns. For many years, there's been running a joint political military group. It's chaired by the American Undersecretary for Security Affairs at the State Department, Rose Gottemoeller, and her Israeli counterpart. That just met a couple of weeks ago in Tel Aviv. And then there are a range of consultative groups on economic issues, energy. Just last week I had a delegation of deputy ministers and directors general from Israel in my office who were here for a joint emergency planning exercise in Alaska, of all places. It took me a while to figure that one out, but it illustrates how deep the relationship is and how with many governments, you just have the State Department talking to the other government's foreign ministry. With Israel, it's across the government, often in places that we're not even aware of at the State Department. At the center of all of these ties, I would say the central pillar is the security relationship. As I mentioned, it's partly because the U.S. and Israel face common challenges in the region. And also it's simply a reflection of the deep interest that the American government and the American people have in Israel's security. There are frequent joint exercises between the two militaries, some of them quite large. Just last week we had the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dempsey, in Tel Aviv. There's U.S. military assistance to Israel. Those of you who follow the relationship, I'm sure, are familiar with the $3.1 billion a year in foreign military funding. There's also significant money that goes toward, in addition to that, toward Israel's Iron Dome system, and a lot of cooperation on weapons development. All of this is done, finally, to complement our policy on Israel's qualitative military edge. The United States is required by law, actually, to look at all of our relationships with the other militaries in the region through the lens of maintaining Israel's qualitative military edge. There's very important diplomatic and policy coordination that goes on between the two governments alongside these important security issues. For example, the administration is committed to fighting biased treatment of Israel in the UN and other international bodies. This is something that our diplomats engage on every day alongside their Israeli counterparts. Some of these issues are way down in the diplomatic weeds, but they're important. For instance, recently, with American support, Israel was able to return to the Human Rights Council on terms that were reasonable for Israel. We also helped Israel to join a couple of regional groupings, which are very important in the way the UN operates. There's also a working group that I participate in that teleconferences regularly every couple of weeks with senior Israeli diplomats in Tel Aviv to coordinate strategy on on UN issues. In addition to this policy and this policy coordination, there's also a very important economic relationship and the cultural relationship. On the economy, Israel has made amazing progress in the past generation. It went from being a recipient of U.S. assistance to the point where they no longer needed it. The United States is Israel's largest single-country trade partner. Bilateral trading in services, in goods and services, grew from $4.7 billion in 1985, and that's the year we signed our free trade agreement, to $45 billion in 2012. U.S. investment in Israel is was at $10.2 billion in 2012, and U.S. investment has played a critical role in the development of Israel's high-tech sector. The ties have been strengthened also by a number of bilateral scientific and other boards that, again, without providing actual money, help coordinate U.S.-Israel cooperation in technical areas. Israel's education and cultural sectors are just as strong. Like the economy, this channel of cooperation thrives without government support. There are thousands of Israelis studying in U.S. universities. There are about 1,500 Americans studying in Israel. The U.S. government also vigorously supports educational collaboration by funding over 200 university, professional, and other exchanges between the two countries. The State Department also funds programming inside Israel in which thousands of Israelis participate, most importantly in English language training. And then there's just the ties between the two peoples. Every year, about 360,000 Israelis travel to the U.S., about double that number of Americans traveling to Israel. I also want to say a few words about the U.S. relationship with the Palestinians, which is also a very important relationship, and one that supports, I would argue, Israel's security. The Palestinian Authority is a force for stability in the West Bank. The Israelis themselves recognize that, especially in the areas of security cooperation. And the Palestinian Authority is a counterweight to those among the Palestinians who still advocate violent resistance. And then, of course, in other parts of the Arab world, there remains intense emotional interest in the Palestinian issue. So it's an important U.S. interest to try to address that. This is why you see the Secretary of State devoting a huge amount of his time over the past 8 months to this effort. So in order to support the Palestinian Authority, the U.S. provides assistance in the area of programming. It's worth about $200 million a year. USAID tries to support the development of Palestinian institutions, Palestinian governance, also to address humanitarian needs. There's also a very important security assistance that we provide to the Palestinian Authority, funded at about $100 million a year. This assistance has succeeded, I would argue, in building up Palestinian security forces that are now a valued partner to Israeli security forces. There's also U.S. assistance to refugees. I'm stepping back from the Palestinian Authority and looking at Palestinians throughout the region. Across the Near East, our support for the UN Refugee and Works Agency, UNRWA, helps some of the most valuable people, some of the most vulnerable people in the region. And then, as with Israel, there are important cultural exchanges, although not on such a large scale. Now, in the background to all this, of course, there is the ongoing Israel-Palestinian conflict. It's something that it's an important U.S. interest to try to address this, both because of the American commitment to Israel's security, our concern for stability in the region, and also because of our concern for the situation of the Palestinians. But because of all these interests, it would be an important step forward if we were able to reach some kind of agreement between the two parties. I'm sure, from following the news, you've seen that over the past week or so, the negotiations have entered a very difficult period. But they're not over yet. Secretary Kerry was just speaking today in the Senate, and he noted that the parties continue to meet. Both parties were stating as late as yesterday publicly that they want talks to continue. But clearly, finding a way forward is going to be difficult at this point. And as Secretary Kerry has said, we don't support talks just for the sake of talks. So he and his team, Ambassador Indyk, the special envoy, will be working very, very hard, I'm sure, in the coming weeks to try to get the talks back on track. But if we were able to reach an agreement in this area, I think Israel and the United States would reap huge benefits. With that, I'd be happy to address any questions, focus on areas of the most interest to you. James, do you want us to move over here and open it up, or?
Yeah, I will.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. So we will open the floor right up to questions. I will call questions from the podium. You may direct questions to one or both panelists. Please keep your questions brief, and if you have a prefatory statement, please keep that brief as well. One in the middle here.
Yeah, I thought it was concerned with the federal solution. By the way, I'm Mark Henzel. I'm just a 20-year-old citizen of Boston. But I'm very concerned about the settlements policy. It seems provocative, and it strikes me that it undercuts Israel's moral position in terms of the peace process. So my question is, why don't they stop it? I guess in America, you have a sense of fairness, and that doesn't seem fair. That seems like, they're taking land that whenever, if there is a two-state solution, that land will probably go to the Palestinians. So why not just stop it now?
The question, we can throw that to both panelists if you like. Rationale and justification for settlements.
Yeah, let me just say that unlike Mr. Henzel, I'm not a representative of a government, so I'll let him explain the official position. I'm merely a citizen. I happen to vote in both countries, and I also pay taxes in both countries. And as an American, I oppose the settlements officially and unofficially. And an Israeli, I'm also critical of the settlements. And I would love to see the country get out of it. And if you take a look at the majority of people in Israel, they too would be willing to forego the settlements. In fact, Israel has withdrawn from the Sinai, it withdrew from Lebanon, it withdrew from Gaza, and it must and it will, I hope, withdraw from at least most of the West Bank. And the reason why it hasn't yet is far more complex than I can give you in a short answer. But ultimately, it will have to, and in part because it wants to.
Well, thanks. I can just comment that, as you probably know, the U.S. government views the settlements as illegitimate, and this is consistent with the position U.S. administrations, both Republican and Democrat, have held going back a generation. The settlements are one of the core issues, one of the most difficult ones to address in the Secretary Kerry's been trying to get the parties to address. And in the difficulty they ran into last week, Secretary Kerry was saying just today that it was another Israeli announcement about settlements that may have actually precipitated the crisis, along with some other issues. So yes, they not only are they illegitimate, they're also unhelpful, as we saw in the talks last week.
Jim.
Although it's not what governs the Jim Kaufman, the present negotiations are not, as far as I understand, under the auspices of the roadmap. The roadmap negotiations took place several years ago, including demands on both Israelis and Palestinians. And for the Israelis, it was the cessation of additional settlement building. And for the Palestinians, it was a demand that they dismantle terrorist organizations. You don't understand why the United States has been so quiet with respect to the demand from the Palestinian Authority to challenge vigorously the terrorist organizations, and against in particular Hamas.
Well, that's a good question. I would. Could you repeat the question? Well, basically, it's a question about terrorist groups and the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian Authority's approach to them. First of all, Hamas is in Gaza, where the Palestinian Authority no longer has any control, and they've got a few cells in the West Bank. And you find that they're usually Fatah and which basically runs the Palestinian Authority, and Hamas and other groups like it are usually at each other like cats and dogs. In fact, in our human rights report on the Palestinian Authority, we don't really get into it too deeply, but many of the abuses we cite there are actually Palestinian Authority going after Hamas people. I would argue that the Palestinian Authority under President Abbas has, over the past few years, grown into a useful security partner to the Israelis. That's partly because the U.S. now for 6 or 7 years has been investing a lot of money in training led by U.S. military officers, training for the Palestinian Authority security forces. And that training is not just on soldiering and policing. There are also, human rights courses and rule of law indoctrination melded into that. So I think it's helped to produce a security force that's more suited to working with the Israelis. Last year, especially mostly in the second half of the year, I think there were 12 Israelis killed by Palestinians. In some of these cases, it's not clear if they were politically motivated. In just about all of them, the best we and the Israelis can tell was that these were individual acts, not organized violence. Clearly, that's that's lamentable and something the Palestinian Authority needs to try to counter. But compared to the situation a few years ago, when you had scores of Israelis being killed, often by organized groups, I think that's an improvement. And again, just a reminder that I haven't talked at all about the violence coming out of Gaza, but the Palestinian Authority doesn't have control there. Thanks. Does that address the issue? Or?
It does mostly, but I guess my concern is that, and I understand that the Hamas rests in control in Gaza, but for there to be a true lasting peace, it would strike me that the entire Palestinian parliament needs to buy into a two-state solution. And for the Israelis to buy into a two-state solution, to evacuate most of the West Bank, so they'd have to have a sense of security. And part of that would be a change in the nature of organizations that are dedicated to battle that outcome.
Right.
And I don't hear the United States government speaking to that issue.
Well, I think we consistently denounce what Hamas does, and the pressure on Hamas has become quite considerable now between the Israeli blockade of the territory and the new attitude of the new Egyptian regime. Hamas is under a lot of pressure now. In fact, I think that the recent rocket attacks, as best anyone can tell, were probably from the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and not from Hamas, although clearly Hamas is held responsible for what goes on. So I think the U.S. government recognizes this for the problem it is. I think the approach has been to try to, if we could achieve a settlement between the Israelis and the authorities in the West Bank, I guess the hope that would certainly be an improvement over the current situation, and there's the hope that when people in Gaza see the benefits accruing to the Palestinians in the West Bank, that might further undermine the Hamas regime.
May I just add that one of the reasons why I think the United States is the country that can act as the honest broker between Palestinians and Israelis is because both understand that America is committed to a two-state solution. And they would like America to lean on the other to make it possible and to maybe perhaps interpret how that outcome would arrive differently. But I think that it is precisely that American commitment that makes it possible for the talks to continue, even if they do so haltingly.
Thank you. I will ask the primary addressee of each question on the panel to repeat the question for the benefit of our recording. And we'll go next to Steve here.
It seems to me that the two leaders of these groups, Netanyahu and Abbas, aren't going to be together. It's just my own opinion. In today's New York Times, there was a good article on
It's hard for me to hear.
Marwan Barghouti,
Yeah.
is that the question? Yeah.
who's been in jail, but who really seems to be the most prominent Palestinian to negotiate with. And one would wonder what would happen if you had a strong Palestinian like this chap, or and a different prime minister of Israel. You say that most of the Israelis would like to get out of the settlements and everything. They shouldn't vote that way. They're voting for Netanyahu, the ones who are part of Netanyahu.
Maybe that's sort of two questions. Maybe if I could address first the question about, first of all, Abu Mazen's standing and Barghouti as a. The question was, you expressed the view that Netanyahu and President Abbas aren't really going to reach an agreement, partly because of President Abbas's, what would you say, lack of legitimacy or lack of political standing. I would just challenge the presumption, the premise there, because I mean, first of all, President Abbas is in control of Fatah and the Palestinian Authority. He's demonstrated his commitment to negotiations and to nonviolence. And at the beginning of the talks, both parties made some very difficult concessions, which I think demonstrates that both Netanyahu and President Abbas had a sincere desire to come to an agreement. They haven't reached one yet, obviously, but first on Netanyahu's side, there was the agreement to release prisoners, which is extremely painful politically to him. And then on the Palestinian side, there was the agreement not to go to the UN to try to upgrade Palestinian status, something that's very popular on the Palestinian street, and Abbas has gotten a lot of criticism for that. He's also under heavy criticism for even talking to the Israelis while settlement construction continues. So I think they both demonstrated a sincere desire to try to find a solution. Just unfortunately, we haven't reached it yet.
I'd be happy to respond to the business about the internal political situation in Israel. I would remind everyone that it was Begin, a right-winger, that made peace with Sadat, with Egypt. It was Rabin who, if we picked out some of his quotes about what should be done to Palestinians, who shook hands with Arafat. That was perhaps the most right-wing general and who came to prominence in Israeli politics, Ariel Sharon, who withdrew from Gaza. I would not put it beyond the possibility of Netanyahu actually coming to the table and acting upon what he has publicly said, that there should be a two-state solution, which necessarily means withdrawal. It can't happen that way, and maybe it can only happen with someone from the right wing who will come to the table and do so. My understanding of Israeli voting patterns is that by and large Israelis are in the middle, and given the opportunity, will take a chance for withdrawal if they can get real peace. There has never been, in the whole history of the Zionist movement, through the present moment, any Israeli political party that ever had a majority. The most that any party ever got was the Labour Party before the state, 40% of the vote. In short, Israel is made up of coalitions of people of many different visions, apprehensions, desires, but when it comes to a critical issue, they are capable of moving in very dramatic ways.
We'll go to the back on my left.
Yes, my name is Bob. I have a quick question. What bearing does the fact that the Palestinians, especially Abbas, refuses to accept the existence or the formal state of Israel as an existent state? What bearing does it have on the present situation and ongoing? And if he in fact should publicly do so, and Nasrallah chooses to try to take him out, what would the United States do to protect him?
Okay, on the recognition question, actually the the PLO has recognized the State of Israel. The Palestinian Authority has recognized the State of Israel. I think the question you're referring to is these Israeli demand that the Palestinian Authority, or the PLO, I'm not sure which they want, recognize Israel as the state of the Jewish people, I think is the language. So the problem from the Palestinian point of view is they would argue first, well, we've already recognized the state of Israel. And to recognize Israel as the Jewish state or a Jewish state would first of all compromise the rights of the Arabs who live in Israel, who are, I think, 20% of the population or so.
20.
And as well as another important Palestinian demand, which is, well, they argue for the return of refugees. Realistically, I think they would hope for some kind of partial return, compensation, something to be negotiated. Actually, Secretary Kerry was asked about this today, and he reiterated his point that even though this seems like an insoluble question, there might be ways to work this out, but toward the end of negotiations. It might be, I would hope, for instance, that maybe the Palestinians would be able to, the two parties could agree on some statement along with a bunch of other things they'd get. Most importantly, something addressing the refugee issue.
The difficult part of the question is that we're talking about symbols and not really substance. But symbols can have great force in that part of the world and maybe even here. Would that the question would never have been raised. But since it has been raised, it arouses all kinds of suspicions of what the interpretation of that state might be, and what it's viewed as a unwillingness to accept the end of conflict. And the end of conflict was articulated by the United Nations when it created a Palestinian state and a Jewish state. It repeats again and again the notion of a Jewish state in Palestine. And there's an unwillingness to return to or obviate that initial moment that gave legitimacy to the creation of a Jewish state.
Thank you. Our friend Siri Karm in the back.
In 1956, the great Jewish journalist Hayat Stone summed up the Arab-Israeli conflict as the dispute between two peoples, each of whom has having the same right to the same piece of land, neither of whom willing to acknowledge the right of the other. I'm wondering if both of you can comment on that, whether it's valid, whether it's useful.
Well, it's a little too philosophical for me. I'm just a day-to-day government employee, but I think the two-state solution is the only way to address that concern. You can't provide both parties all the land, but you can, one hopes, get them eventually to agree to each having their own part of it.
Yeah, the British said it best and first in 1937 in the Peel Commission. They did what every single other international commission and serious scholars do to this day. They list in one column the justifications for the Palestinian point of view, and they list in the other column the justifications for the Jewish point of view. And the best of these do not try to say which one is right. They let it just stand there. And the British said, well, half a loaf is better than none. That we can't engage in absolute justice at any one moment in history. Be pragmatic, take what you can get, and live. And it's that wisdom which can be best brought by outside parties. And I would say to my colleague to the left that his role and the role of the United States government is essential in bringing together any kind of progress. Because if the parties are left to themselves, the extreme voices calling for justice now will overcome those who think of pragmatic ways in which people can live together.
Here, in the second row.
Is there no other entity other than the United States that could possibly be more successful in brokering a peace? The United Nations, NATO, certain countries, I don't know, Russia.
Question is, any entities that might be more successful than the United States?
Well, I'll take that first. The American position, of course, has, not surprisingly, I guess, has always been that, as a practical matter, the American government, sometimes with help and support from others, is the only one really situated to serve as a broker between the two. Now, one of the dangers that we face is that there are many in the Palestinian camp and their friends around the world who argue that no, the Americans can't or won't do this. The Palestinians need to go to the United Nations. And our view is that that would be unlikely to produce a successful outcome. The Israelis would probably feel very insecure, having to deal with the United Nations that they view as hostile, and which I would agree in some cases is unfairly biased against Israel. So I just don't see that as a realistic option. Now, that said, as I mentioned, we do try to involve others where they have some value to add. For instance, there's the so-called quartet, where you've got the UN and the Europeans and others involved. And from time to time, they are able to lend a hand. But I think a U.S. leading role is essential to any kind of successful outcome.
Yeah, I agree to that completely.
Thank you. Tal.
Hi, Tal. Thanks for speaking to us. Two quick questions. One for both panelists. Do you feel that President Obama's willingness to interface more openly with a lot of the Arab countries, more so during his first term, has had a positive or negative impact on both U.S.-Israeli and U.S.-Palestinian relations? And then secondly, a question for Mr. Henzel, which might be a little bit critical and shouldn't overshadow any of the positive things that you said about the U.S.-Israel relationship earlier. But the U.S. maintains its embassy in Tel Aviv, and on a lot of official U.S. documents, it doesn't recognize Jerusalem as being a part of Israel. It recognizes it as a separate entity unto itself. I just had the opportunity now to address a State Department official with that question. So I wonder if the official answers.
Well, I think the Jerusalem answer is a short one. The U.S. views Jerusalem as a disputed, its status is not resolved, and until it is resolved in negotiations between the parties, we and almost every other country in the world maintain our embassies in Tel Aviv. And that's a position that Democratic and Republican administrations have taken for years, and which just about every other country in the world takes.
That's unfortunate because the capital of the country is the capital of a country. And if anybody thinks that Jerusalem is going to return to the international condominium envisaged both by the partition plans and the United Nations, is being very unrealistic. And the reason for not doing so is out of sensitivity to how it might affect others. It might be interpreted as a one-sided political statement. That I can understand, but it does grate. It does irritate Israelis to think that the United States of America, its best friend in the world, will not accept what is an obvious fact, that Jerusalem is the capital of the country.
You also had a question about President Obama's engagement.
Yes.
I mean, I can tell you, I was in the region when he was elected, and there was a very positive response, especially to his Cairo speech. His interest in the region and in the Israel-Palestine issue, I think, has been demonstrated by the efforts made first. I mean, in his first administration, in the first week, he appointed Senator Mitchell, who made his attempt at negotiations. He now has a Secretary of State who's made it one of his top priorities, and this has all been done with the president's backing. And I think that's something that's appreciated in the region.
I don't envy anybody being the President of the United States. If you serve one term, that's bad enough. But to serve 2 terms, you have to make an awful lot of statements in the course of 8 years. And the tendency of all of us is to pluck out of that welter of statements those things that are either positive or, more naturally, those words that are offensive. And Obama has now been in office long enough to alienate everybody.
We have time for 3 questions. I see one in the very back.
I just have a question on the history of walls have been pretty bad with the Great Wall of China, the Berlin Wall. What about that wall in Israel? How long will that stay up?
I can only hope that the wall in Israel will not last as long as the Great Wall in China. And in terms of the Berlin Wall, walls come up and they come down. And that wall is not built to be permanent. As a matter of fact, the wall is misunderstood here. I forget the statistics. About 90% of the wall is fence and can easily be removed. And also people do know how to take down concrete, even in Israel. So that wall is not necessarily permanent. And the wall is not a wall in terms of Israeli, the lexicon of Israeli politics. It's a security barrier. And it's serving that purpose very, very well indeed. And for so long as that security barrier is necessary, the wall will be there.
If I could just comment, the part of the separation barrier that's on Israeli territory, I don't think is controversial. The controversy arises over where the barrier cuts into the occupied West Bank, not only because it's very often people's property needs to be confiscated or else placed outside of their reach, but also because it's viewed by the Palestinians as they fear that it is meant to be permanent, especially when you see the barrier stretching out to encompass a particular settlement block that looks like a permanent move. But as you pointed out, it doesn't have to be. We hope it isn't.
We have one question here on my left. We still have time for a couple questions.
This feels like Israel. Excuse me?
My name is Craig James. I want to thank the panelists for your presentation today. Successive Israeli administrations have, in cases, either given back land, Gaza, for example, or made extraordinary concessions, Rabin and Arafat, offering 98% or so of what was requested, and had been met with intifadas or just walked away. My question is, what does the current administration expect to achieve with the current round of talks, given that all these offers have been made and not accepted?
Well, the administration is convinced that the Palestinians, at least the Palestinians led by President Abbas, are interested in a final status agreement. They have renounced violence. They've taken steps against violent groups in areas under their control. As I mentioned earlier, if you ask the Israeli security forces, they've developed a useful relationship with the Israeli security forces. None of these are the kinds of steps I'd expect from a leadership that's really just interested in continuing the status quo. As for past negotiations, a lot of these percentages you hear are reports that came out, from unnamed sources. The documents of the supposed offers often there were no documents. They were just oral statements, so you have to decide whose word you're going to trust. And of course, all these negotiations have the principle that nothing's agreed until everything's agreed. So I would say that the failure of past negotiations don't necessarily mean that new negotiations can't work. I think both parties, at least the reasonable elements on both sides, have a real interest in reaching success.
I would just add that Israel has a deep interest in the legitimacy of the Palestinian Authority, and it is very pleased by the role the United States has played in training and provisioning the police forces, the gendarmerie of the Palestinian Authority. But it's more than that. Every question here, or most of the questions here, deal with conflict. There is actually, and I'm sure that you can speak to it as well, Chris, that there's actually considerable cooperation that goes between the two in terms of students studying medicine, training, cooperative projects on water, in health, attempts at mutual coexistence, bringing young people together. Often outsiders become catalysts for this. To give up and to only investigate that part of the relationship which is fraught with anxiety and indeed expresses itself in conflict is in a sense almost to create a wish fulfillment situation. Some attention has to also be paid to the ways in which Israelis and Palestinians who share the same land, the same water, the same sun, and who all know that they're going to have to live together. In fact, many are trying to live together. My children go to a school, or my grandchildren go to a school where there are 2 teachers in every class. One is a Hebrew teacher, teaches in Hebrew, the other one teaches in Arabic. The students at my university come from many different sectors in the country. My son, who went to a high school in Jerusalem, there were settlers and there were liberals from Tel Aviv, and there were Arabs and Jews, Christians, Ethiopians, Russian immigrants, and there are many, many, many serious attempts to bring people together. And it would be wonderful if one could someday sponsor a meeting here of what can be done to abet that kind of coexistence and mutual understanding.
Thank you. I see 2 remaining questions, and we will try and get those in. Please keep them brief and intellectually oriented. Here. Yes.
Okay. Hi, I have a question for both speakers. It's actually about Jonathan Pollard. What's the likelihood that the United States government will release Jonathan Pollard, say, in the next 30 days?
The likelihood of releasing Jonathan Pollard.
I defer to an official of the United States government.
Well, Jonathan Pollard was convicted of very serious crimes. There have been no steps to bring about his early release. And I think the report you saw in the media last week was a case of the reporters getting ahead of the facts.
Thank you. Brief questions, so we do have time for 2 final questions here. We'll start, go from front row to back. We'll go Jim, and then this question on my left.
So my question relates to what's happening with Russia at the moment. The relationship with the United States, obviously Russia, particularly Ukraine, is rather strained. Russia has been a partner of sorts in negotiations with respect to Iran. Could you comment, Mr. Henzel, and Professor Cohen also, if you wish, any perspective on the impact on the relationship between the United States and Israel negotiations if Russia plays a more obstructionist role?
How Russia factors into U.S.-Israel relations.
Well, the relationship with Russia is going through quite a dramatic period right now, even today, and I'm not sure what might have happened today. But up until now, we haven't seen any impact of that problem in the Israel-Palestinian question. Russia plays a much more important role in the P5+1 talks. I think the administration's assessment is that the Russians are in those talks because of their own interests, not as a favor to us, and we expect them to continue to play that role. And personally, I mean, I don't work directly on Iran issues, but I'm not aware of any important bleed over between those 2 issues yet.
It's very worrying, and the worry is that the Russia of Gorbachev may turn out to be the Russia of his predecessors, and they were not allies of the Jewish state except in the first years of the after independence. There is something else that's taking place. The immigration or emigration of Jews from the Ukraine is becoming very substantial as Ukrainian Jews read the map of the situation in which they are in. And those of us who are Israelis would like for people to make Aliyah, perhaps even you. But to have people come to the country out of these kinds of circumstances is not desirable.
And here, gentleman with your hand up and blue shirt.
My name is Saul. Maybe a naive question, but when I heard the Secretary's words, I thought it was positive. I thought that eventually lead to more direct talks between the Israelis and Palestinians. But I'm trying to be thinking, I want to hear your thoughts on less brokeraging done by the U.S. that leads to more or less talks, direct talks between Israel and Palestinians.
would less direct brokering by the U.S. lead to increased or decreased bilateral talks between Israelis and Palestinians?
I think our assessment is now that just in the current situation, they do need an American broker. Not always in the room. Ambassador Indyk, for a lot of this process, wasn't even in the room. He was available if either party wanted him there. And of course, remember that Oslo was negotiated without the Americans at first. So certainly, in theory, I could see that happen, and we would welcome it if they got together on their own. But just now, we don't see that happening.
As somebody who does read diplomatic documents that are 30, 40, 50 years old, I can tell you that what happened in the past is occurring in the present. There are always conversations, if not direct, and in all kinds of places. And indeed, there's a part of me that wishes that the Americans weren't involved, because academics like me could spend their summers in Salzburg, or go to Norway, or go to Australia, where we could meet our Palestinian colleagues and have discussions, and when we're ready, then we can ask the Americans to come in. Excuse me?
You can still do that.
We can still do that, and let me just suggest to you, in fact, does take place.
Thank you both, gentlemen.